Hey everyone, I'm Dylan, Unreal Engine Supervisor at Model Farm, and welcome to my talk, Pushing Visual Boundaries Without Breaking the Bank. One of the things I often hear about when talking to developers and cinematics artists, and pretty much a lot of other people as well, is that a large amount of them seem to have the opinion that a lot of Unreal's higher end features are not really for them. They see it as, no, I need a AAA team for that, or a huge budget to kind of get to use those features. Basically, the reason I want to do this talk is to show just how easy these features are to use and to push further without having to spend a ton of money or time to get kind of very high-end visual looks while being fairly performant at the same time. Yeah. So let's take a look at the chapters I want to cover today. This is split up into a few sections: leveling up some post-processing, bending Lumen to your will, high-resolution assets fast, fog cards are out, voxels are in, taking translucency to the next level, and MegaLights is your best friend, which is experimental, I have to say that. But before we get into the good stuff, a quick bit about myself and what we do at Model Farm. Growing up in Adelaide, Australia, always had a passion for film, games, and 3D rendering. In my high school years, I learned Maya 7 from some kind of questionable tutorial CDs my dad got off eBay. And from that point on, I was off, started using Unreal 3 in UDK a year or so before Unreal 4 came out. And ever since then, I've kind of been chasing ways to get as much visual fidelity out of the engine as I can. Which kind of means I've been using Unreal for like 13 years. In 2018, I kind of started my main professional career in the film and TV visual effects industry as a junior lighting artist at Mill Film, and quickly built upon my passion for lighting and rendering while working on films like Dora, Love and Monsters, Finch, Mortal Kombat, and Cats. That's right, I survived Cats. Then in late 2020, in the midst of COVID, I got the chance to kind of combine my love of Unreal and visual effects at Model Farm. So Model Farm's a highly skilled boutique visual effects studio, small team, and we constantly punch above our weight with Unreal Engine and Houdini expertise. We work on a wide range of projects such as large visual experiences for education and entertainment, children's animation like Lego Dreams and Eddie's Little Homies, feature films and series, including The Equalizer 3, Pope's Exorcist, the recent Unreal Engine-powered Piece by Piece Pharrell Lego movie, and the upcoming sequel Spartacus series, House of Asher, and even on-set virtual production with films like Beast of War, which is coming out, I'm guessing, this year. Here's a sampling of some of our work. Aside from my day job, if you've ever checked out my socials, you'll know I always have some insane side project going on, whether it be stupidly detailed gum trees, my recent collaboration with NVIDIA on Through the Ages, creating accurate video card assets with up to 130 million polys each, the all-important procedural Blu-ray generator, or 2 consecutive Epic Mega Jam winners for the graphics category. I'm always striving to do interesting things with Unreal while melting GPUs in the process. Lastly, I'm also a seller on Fab. So with a range of fairly successful cinematic-focused tools like Ocean System for Rendered Cinematics, cinematic lens flares, as well as a few fun nanite asset packs like cinematic screws, cinematic floppies, cinematic gloop. I swear I'm completely normal. Go check those out if that interests you, though. Cinematic flares is one I'm particularly proud of. So let's dive into our first chapter here, which is really a fairly simple one, post-processing. When I usually first set up an Unreal project, this is usually my first port of call to set the baseline look. Although some of these settings are, fairly simple, I find a lot of people kind of overlook them a lot of the time or don't know they exist. Some of the reasoning I hear when not using some of these features or higher end visual features in Unreal are along the lines of, doesn't that cost a lot? Isn't that just for offline cinematics? Or, the quality isn't good enough. These settings are some easy wins for pushing the visual look of your project, and sometimes having an understanding of these is what really gets your project looking a bit more professional. And you don't really need to worry about the high cost of things as much these days, because it's improving all the time. First, here we have our bloom settings, which is like the most basic thing you can do, right? Before Unreal Engine 5, switching from standard bloom, which looks like this, it's just okay. You get like a uniform glow effect on bright areas, but we can do better. Back before Unreal Engine 5, it's much more hip cousin convolution bloom. More accurately simulates how bloom works in the real world, but it was expensive at the time. And I think that many are generally remembering from this time period, and as a result of just kind of avoiding it altogether. When in reality, convolution bloom since UE5 has been quite performant, thanks to it rendering at a lower resolution now, and various other improvements. As you can see here, with a simple change, you get a much more visually pleasing result with kind of little rays and not just a uniform blur glow on everything. Great thing about convolution bloom is that it's completely scalable. You can manually control the resolution that bloom renders at. This works for normal bloom as well, with r.bloom.screen percentage to optimize even further to what's required for your project. For example, this pretty console here, full of flashing lights, the way all sci-fi panels should look. Convolution gets us these big, beautiful bloom glints off of each one as they turn on and off. We're using the full resolution convolution bloom here, which is a bit expensive. This is like it was in UE4. It's costing us 0.9 milliseconds per frame here. And if you're rendering a cinematic with this, then with very high frequency details, sure, you want it at full resolution usually, because you're not worrying about real time. But this is an easy win by lowering this. Let's go to the extreme. Here we have the same scene, but rendering the convolution bloom past at only 5% screen resolution, so really low. Only costing us a measly 0.035 milliseconds now, and to be honest, even with these smaller light shapes, I'm hard-pressed to see much of a difference at all. We're still getting our beautiful bloom glints with minimal artifacting. If you look real close, you can see like there's a little bit, but in motion, you're not really going to notice. After a very long time without many changes, depth of field in Unreal Engine has actually had some significant work recently in the last few years. As someone who's been calling for this constantly, this is a great win by making your work kind of more cinematic and varied. Some of the additions over the past few years include the anamorphic stretch support for bokeh, and more recently, the addition of Petzfeld controls for all the Helios 44M lens lovers out there, like me, making it possible to really fine-tune your visual style and get swirly bokeh. But one of the most useful changes in the last few years is that we can now toggle actual resolution that depth of field's rendered at with r.doff resolution divisor 1 or 2. By default, it's on 2. This can be really useful not only to optimize to go lower resolution if it's a performance issue, but also go the opposite direction and fix any doff artifacts you might run into. For example, this is a fairly subdued example, but it's more realistic to what you might encounter every day. Sometimes you're doing a shallow focus on a mesh or a scene with a lot of high frequency detail or thin straight lines at angles. If we take a look at the edges around this great looking 5¼ inch floppy disk, we can see that along the out of focus edges, there's a bit of a kind of aliasing stepping effect that you're seeing as the camera moves. And that's because it's rendering at lower resolution. If we chuck in r.doff resolution divisor 1, we can see it reduces the effect rendering at full resolution, which is slightly more expensive, but Out of all the effects, changing this doesn't seem to make a huge difference really at all in my testing. It's definitely gotten me out of a lot of binds before with a lot of my content, getting it actually out without any aliasing, especially if you have like really high frequency grates or grills that are out of focus, because that can alias like crazy. Now you may say, this doesn't really apply to games because we don't use cine cameras. And you may be right, but I actually like to advocate for people to swap out your regular camera in gameplay systems for cine cameras. Being able to work with cinematic camera controls in gameplay situations just opens up a whole level of realism and just makes things a bit easier. Like these shallow focus macro looks, I've employed in some of my small side projects, game jam games like Anos Venture, Cardboard Kitty. Not to mention, using cine camera controls is generally easier and everything adheres to a reproducible rule set. If you're familiar with real cameras, then you're at a real advantage there. Anyone who's tried to use depth of field with a normal Unreal camera will probably appreciate not having to do that, because this is just pre-set up and easy to use. Now, probably the most important thing of all in terms of post-processing is to disable Unreal's default lens flares. They haven't really been touched in a very long time, and you can spot them from a mile away. If only there is some kind of custom HLSL-based lens flare asset available on Fab. Anyway, motion blur often catches the eye of many gamers all the time. And personally, I think that a big proportion of people are turned off, not because motion blur sucks, it really doesn't, but because motion blur is left on default settings. This is especially important when approaching any kind of filmic look. It's pretty simple stuff, but I do find that many don't realize that you can actually set these to get the most out of your motion blur, and not only a higher quality look, but also visual consistency, no matter your performance. So let's get to a key issue here, is that a lot of games I see like to tie the motion blur amount to the shutter and the shutter speed to actual gameplay frame rate. So we end up with a difference in motion blur going from a 30 FPS quality mode, for example, to a 60 FPS performance mode. Even worse is if it's based on a variable frame rate, then your motion blur's amount is constantly changing. And if you suddenly run into a heavy area that sends your FPS down, you end up suddenly going from like minimal motion blur to like just a mess. Everything is just a lot of very blurred. Then you turn back to the non-heavy part and then, suddenly everything's okay again. Our motion blur target FPS, it's also in the post-process volume, you can set it there, lets you essentially set a fixed shutter speed equivalent. Want your project to be filmic, set it to 24, which gets you consistent, silky smooth motion blur no matter your FPS to get a result like this. And here it is at 60, which is obviously a lower shutter setting. So it's part of your, just for fun, set it to 10 and even 5, which is probably useless, but you can do it. You can go even further, but I don't recommend it. In addition, you can use motion blur separable and scatter to really increase the overall quality of the effect. This is without, this is with. So it's just less artifacts, a much more silky smooth blur. So next chapter is about Lumen. Lumen's a pretty powerful and easy to use feature, obviously. Over the past few releases, it's gotten to a point where, in some circumstances, its output can be approaching kind of path trace quality, which is pretty insane. Let's take a look at how I usually try and push Lumen to get an almost offline rendered look and feel, but in real time. Firstly, hardware Lumen is generally the way to go now. The last, as of 5.6, I believe it's default on. And there's been like 3 or 4 generations of ray tracing capable cards now. So should really be the default. Different projects do require different approaches though, so depending on the lighting situation, these tips may vary. But overall, I like to lean on the following setup as a base, then tweak from there depending on the situation. So with hardware Lumen enabled, you can actually have 3 choices for how the Lumen scene works. You've got surface cache, hit lighting for reflections, and hit lighting. These got added in a few releases ago, but again, not many people tend to actually know they exist there. And choosing the right one for the right situation is paramount to avoid some issues down the line, whether it be performance or certain things not appearing in the Lumen scene and overall quality. Let's take a look at these modes in the context of a scene. This scene is from my project Days Adrift. It's a very tricky one for Lumen in general. Lots of shiny and rough metallic surfaces, transparencies and emissives. Surface cache is what most would call standard hardware Lumen. It's generally the fastest solution, but often you'll notice that the lighting updates and reflections are quite rough, generally a bit over bright, and can suffer from a lot of pop-in when you're moving around or if the lighting scene changes. Hit lighting for reflections sticks with the surface cache for global illumination, but uses hit lighting for the reflection rays, which gives you much, much higher quality specular response and reflections. If you have very reflective surfaces like windows, mirrors, puddles, etc., I find myself wanting to generally be using this mode at a minimum, depending on the performance profile, of course, but recent releases have made this mode quite fast, considering what benefits you get. And then lastly, we have hit lighting, which is, as its name suggests, is full hit lighting traces for global illumination and reflections. This mode can be, and generally is, extremely heavy. I usually only recommend it for offline rendering, or in some cases, top-end kind of real-time hardware. But you might notice some of the benefits here with the red cast that's gone, which was like incorrect cast from some tiny emissives in the roof. So it does fix that up and generally gives you a better resolve, especially if your lighting is changing a lot. Most of you already know these options, but yeah, I find that often I run into people and they don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about hit lighting, etc. And it can often fix an issue you're seeing. I really do encourage you all to play around with these modes, like in your project, see what differences it makes, and kind of sometimes it can be quite transformative, especially for reflective environments. Another easy win that I don't see many people taking is if you need the screen space elements of Lumen, because Lumen has a big screen space element. You used to have to use CVARs, but in recent releases, Epic has added some nice checkboxes in the post-process volume. So you can disable them just for GI or reflections. And most of the Lumen artifacts I tend to see people complaining about often seem to be just in the screen space elements. If you disable it, a lot of the time it just basically fixes the issues like I'm having, for example. You can see here as the camera pans up, we don't get obviously some ugly screen space artifacts, but also the screen space reflection is imperfect in terms of like the brightness. It's a bit too bright, brighter than it should be. So here's another shot from Days Adrift with a very strong directional light spilling into the scene, bouncing around. You might notice though that we have a ton of blocky temporal noise, visible in the GI and especially in the reflections. If we check the Lumen scene, we can kind of see our issue. There doesn't seem to be like enough samples causing this very temporally unstable result with a lot of per frame noise and fireflies. The main way I go about fixing or reducing this is actually hemisphere probe resolution. This CVAR has saved many projects from being a noisy mess. By default, it's set at 4, which is generally okay, works for most, a lot of situations. We can actually up this though for not a massive performance cost, and it's quite scalable. So depending on what you need, you might not need to overcrank it, like I probably do. Setting it to 32 here, which is overcranking it. In the Lumen scene view, we can see an instant improvement in reduction of fireflies, as well as overall temporal stability. Now, there's still some flicker going on here, but as we switch back to the lit view using this, we can see that it's enough of a reduction to feel a lot better. You can notice the biggest difference in the ray trace translucency on the pod glass, where it's no longer flickering like it was before. And it flickers a little bit over time, but not so much in your face, just a noise mess. I do often overcrank to 32 for more stability, but I'm usually doing higher end stuff. But which can cause a little bit of a performance increase. But even just doubling this to 8 from 4 can make a huge difference in perceived quality without much of a performance cost in most circumstances. I actually couldn't measure a difference in this scene going from 4 to 8, but it did look better. One of the things I hear a lot is that it's possible to do super high detailed nanite tree, for example, a ridiculously detailed one. But then impossible to expand to a full game's worth of assets. That it would take far too many hours of labor and cost far too much to bring everything up to the same level of detail. And while yes, this can be fairly true in certain situations and workflows, there's always ways to streamline this and workflows to create highly detailed nanite-ready assets without having to spend too much time on each of them. You just have to be smart about it. So back to Days Adrift. Days Adrift, which was visually inspired by Beyond the Achille Rift episode of Love, Death and Robots, has a very high level of detail in all its assets. It was my first project that I really wanted to create all of the assets myself, have no third-party assets, apart from these holograms, which are made by Luke Harris. You should go look at his talk tomorrow. They're really cool holograms. Every mesh asset, essentially a whole environmental library, was created by a single artist, which is me. How did I manage this? In a very short amount of time, like I was working full-time. It was just in my free time after work, basically, a few hours a week, in a couple of months. My process here, which allowed me to create this 80 billion poly scene in this very limited spare time over a couple of months, has become the basis of what is now my main workflow for all of my projects and asset builds. So working an hour or two during the week and then a chunk of time on the weekend, sometimes in around 3 months, I created what amounted to about 176 unique high-resolution assets that were all textured, most using multiple Udemy texture sets. As a side note, this was also my first project using Substrate, which there's a talk on, I think, tomorrow. So you can see that. The centerpiece of which here were obviously high-density control panels, which with hundreds of buttons, lights, panels, switches, small edge detail. I wanted to have extreme close-up macro camera angles without having any issues if I wanted to. I just wanted the complete freedom to make some cool cinematics no matter from where. I didn't want to have to think about, oh, this area is going to have to be more detailed than the rest. So this is them in their final glory. We start off in Houdini, but this also applies to, you could do the same in Blender, for example, using the geometry nodes. Setting up the basic geometry of the asset. In the case of these consoles, it's just a quick and dirty Boolean operations and layouts of shapes that I'd already made, basically a set, and then basically laying them out in a way that I wanted. But as you can probably guess, this wasn't the level of detail I was after. There's no, beveled edges or edge damage and things like that. And I wanted very high resolution geo to be able to really catch the light on all of those edges. So the solution here is then we pipe through templates of detailing graphs in Houdini. So for different material types or object types, I set up, so I only have to set these up once for the first type of object that I'm doing. And then for every subsequent one, I can just plug them in and hit cache and wait 15 minutes, and then I've got an asset ready for texturing. Like this one, for example, had metal, rubber, plastic, and LCD screens, which were, in this instance, just split into 2 respective groups. But sometimes I'd split them into full material types, so the rubber would get rubber-like damage and things like that. So as they go through these graphs, they've got predefined noise operations, SDF subtractions, additions for edge damage, smoothing, up-resing, etc. And in the end, merges all back together, spits out a beautifully dense high poly mesh with UVs automatically created and laid out into Udemy and ready to be textured. Here's what the processing steps look like for the panel casing there, which isn't particularly advanced. But can we speed this up more? The answer is yes, we can. Specifically in the year or so since Days of Drift was finished, this part of my workflow has evolved. Excuse me. Into mostly an SDF volume-based modeling step, speeding up the iteration times and making it very much easier to create more complex hard surface details in a fast way, like this MP3 player here from my short Through the Ages, which came out this year. Next, we move into texturing land. For this, I tend to use Substance Painter. This is a time lapse of the first panel IA setup. So, took a couple of hours, but then subsequent ones, all I had to do was import the model, a new model, in the same scene, make sure the materials were okay, and then hit rebake all of the stuff in Substance, and then I had basically a new material. And then the couple of labels that I had painted on manually, I just do that step. So it ends up like I can spit out a new asset in like, 15, 20 minutes with a different layout. Into UDIMs, along with, obviously, if you're using UDIMs, then you're usually using virtual texturing in Unreal. For this project, I made do with 2K maps, as most objects had a lot of UDIM tiles, which is what I prefer, the way I prefer to work. From here, they're ready to import into Unreal. The majority of the models, while high resolution, were not particularly large file size-wise, with a few exceptions like larger assemblies that I wanted to bake as one object, for example, the cryo beds here. One thing to note is that when using virtual textures in Unreal, you may have run into some ugly momentary blurring of textures. Usually this is due to the feedback factor, r.vt feedback factor. It's a handy CVAR to play around with. Defaults to 16, and essentially this drives the speed at which the changing scene affects the virtual texture streaming. If you're encountering momentary blurring on camera cuts, or for example, or during fast camera movement, you can try lowering this by value of power of 2s, and it often saves you quite a lot of time, like just basically it usually just fixes the issue. The only time it won't fix it is if you're actually running out of VRAM. Then you need smaller textures, basically. Yeah. The setup obviously wasn't fully automated. It's still heavily artist-driven, with tweaks as I went along for different surface damage types. But this was all created over a couple of months in free time on the weekends, so this is the workflow I just use now. And it can easily scale up to a larger team and be pumping out high-resolution assets designed specifically for nanite use at breakneck pace. The thing is, with nanite and virtual textures, your asset workflow does not need to get harder. If anything, I've found it to generally get easier and more streamlined with not having to author and deal with LODs, and as well as preferring decent auto unwraps split over multiple UDIMs versus like traditionally hand doing a UV map. Obviously for characters, you'd still do like anything that's a hero kind of character, you'd want to still do a custom UV. Added benefit of this type of workflow is it's easy to be able to be scaled up or down in terms of the detail needed. It doesn't just work for sci-fi dystopia, it works for MP3 players, retro PCs, natural assets like 60 million poly trees, screws, for example. And for comparatively lower app poly assets like this cool fan I made for this fun game by Joe Wintergreen, Influx Redux. You should go play that. It's a fan, it blows the ball up into the air. Okay, it's a pretty cool fan. Still works for assets up to a certain size, but once you get to a very large object, to be able to effectively manage and create these large objects in this way, you'd need to either split them up into smaller sections or have a workstation with like a terabyte of RAM. If anyone wants to give me some RAM, I'll be around. You might remember my little Facing Worlds UE5 that I posted online, where I did like this little fun little remaster project. And this is where I did run into this limitation because the entire rock you're walking on is one mesh, right? And it was way too big to do the detail I wanted in this way. So I turned to nanite displacement and tessellation, which is really easy to use. You can use it on a landscape, on meshes. It's a little bit slower than stock nanite, obviously, but it generally does a pretty good job. By making sure I had decent UV resolution with the UDIM layout, I made sure to bake out a height map from the substance painter pass and piped that all into the displacement input in the material, and it's really as simple as that. A few tweaks on the settings there, and now we have a crunchy nanite level of detail on an object as large as the entire map, complete with pixel-perfect VSM shadowing. Just going to take a drink. So our next section is on volumetrics, which is cards are out, voxels are in. It's all about, I'm going to say this right because I have to say it lots of times, heterogeneous volumes. Heterogeneous volumes. Heterogeneous volumes are a great, fairly recent addition to Unreal Engine, allowing for high-quality volume representations fed by data from Niagara fluids or imported VDBs converted into sparse volume textures. Let's take a look at this smoke here. This one's referencing a looping baked VDB from Houdini. Looks pretty cool. It's receiving direct light and casting some nice self-shadowing. But let's delve in because, again, there's a lot of CVARs here that people don't tend to know about and that you can add to heterogeneous volumes and how far you can push these visually. With r.heterogeneous volumes indirect lighting, we can actually add indirect light contribution from Lumen, which can really transform the look of smoke or sparse sims. Looking good now. We're getting that orange glow from all the bounce. Everything's a little lighter, fits in the scene better. But it's still missing a bit of something. R.heterogeneous volumes ambient occlusion lets us add some ambient occlusion into the mix. Now that's a bit strong though. We are getting some like pits and more detail in the sim. So let's reduce the amount of ambient occlusion steps being applied to the volume with r.heterogeneous volumes.ambient occlusion.max step count. If we set this to 16, it's much more, takes off the edge off of that result. It's kind of in between. You can go even lower or higher depending on the look you want. If you want really crunchy smoke, then you can like just max it out. A little bonus tip here, when dealing with some VDB bakes, you might notice that it appears a little blurred in Unreal compared to in your source application like Houdini or Embergen. And this took us actually a while to figure out, but it was essentially the filter that was being applied in Unreal. And they've actually added a CVAR for that, which is r.heterogeneous volumes.filter. And you can actually choose the filter. So if you set it to 0, to nearest, that's what it sets it to, you basically get the same result as you had generally in Houdini, for example. And it's saved quite a few renders over the years of us wondering what the hell's going on. While you pay a load time and memory penalty for loading in pre-cached VDBs, you can also use these features on Niagara fluids because they also use heterogeneous volumes. So you can have fully real-time simulations with all these features looking really nice. It's never been a better time to get into true volumes and get rid of cards. Onto translucency, which is a touchy topic. And it all boils down to the fact that translucency is rendered as a separate pass after opaque and masked geometry, which as a result often makes translucent geometry appear as if it doesn't sit well in the scene. But this really doesn't have to be the case anymore. Within the last few releases of Unreal, this issue is actually mostly mitigated with a few exceptions. Just a quick note, let's jump in with some of the guidelines that drive the way I create translucent materials first. If you've seen my previous talk a few years ago at Unreal Fest Gold Coast, Fluids in Unreal, you'll know I prefer to keep my materials as simple as possible, especially translucent ones. And this isn't for performance reasons necessarily. It's purely because most of the time you just don't need to overcomplicate things. This simple glass shader, for example, it's just a standard default lit translucent material. Some key settings here to change would be to use either translucency surface or forward shading to get us popular specular and normal response. And we've got just a color attribute into base color, roughness of 0, opacity to 0.05. And lastly, our refraction mode to index of refraction to give a value of about 1.5. And, it refracts. It kind of looks like glass. That's generally what you do before. On the note of roughness, though, you might be thinking, but translucency doesn't really work with roughness properly. And you'd be fairly right there. By default, the roughness values only apply to our specular reflection, but not our refraction. This is where I turn into the great Matt Osterley and say, Substrate to the rescue. Substrate, I'm sure most of you are at least aware of it, is Unreal Engine's new material system, which is now in development, and which is still in development, but it's actually hit beta status in 5.6. Not only does it have a ton of benefits like crazy cool material blending and glints and fun stuff like that, it also introduces rough refraction for translucent materials. Just so happens that Days Adrift was entirely created using Substrate early on, so let's take a look at this cryogenic pod glass canopy here. The material's fairly simple again. Apart from the addition of a few textures and masks, it's all pretty much the same setup, except with Substrate, we're dealing with more CG industry standard of mean free path instead of opacity, and etc. We've got a texture driving some roughness variation too. And look at that rough refraction as I just changed the roughness and it gets rough. Amazing. This really allows us to create really realistic materials like glass liquids and most notably rough transparent plastics. Highly recommend everyone to start learning Substrate. And as I said earlier, there's a talk tomorrow, I believe, on a bunch of Substrate techniques. It might look a bit daunting at first if you're coming from games background, but once you get over that small little hurdle, it's really mostly benefits and not many downsides. It really opens up what you can do with a material. There's one caveat here though, and that's the fact that I was using pixel normal offset for the refraction mode there. And that's because if you set it to use a proper index of refraction, you might notice, and probably notice in your own projects, it doesn't usually look great. That's because it's screen space based. It's warping the rendered scene based on the index of refraction, which gets us possibly my favorite thing I'm talking about today, which not many people are talking about, which is ray traced refraction. One of the things that I haven't seen that, well, I just said that not many people are talking about it, in 5.6 is there's a brand new ray trace translucency mode that has been implemented. Let's stick with this cryogenic pod here, and as an example, head on over to the translucency method section in your post-process volume, and we can see we now have 3 options in 5.6 instead of the old 2. Option 1 is raster, which is what you're used to, the bog standard default translucency, many issues, the screen space elements, it can only refract what's seen on screen, and it's a uniform single layer of refraction, which really hinders your ability to get kind of a realistic look. And we're getting double ups. We're seeing like it's just looks completely wrong. Option 2, we now have what used to be called ray tracing, translucency, but now it's called legacy ray tracing, deprecated, which is how ray trace translucency worked pre 5.6. There were always a bunch of issues with this. For surfaces like this, you had to crank the max refraction rays way up to avoid any black areas that happened when you didn't have enough depth for the ray to get all the way through the geometry, which made performance absolutely horrendous because you were just essentially ray tracing a lot. The other issue with this is that it's a holdover from like back when, before Lumen, and we had like the ray traced GI and all of that. So it was like a separate ray trace scene that wasn't really controllable. So when you had noise on it, like in this scene here, it's basically impossible to get rid of that noise if there was any amount of like a large amount of indirect lighting in your scene. New in 5.6 is the third option here, which is now called ray trace. So it's replaced the old method, which as you can see makes a big difference. Number one, this uses Lumen's hit lighting now. So it's all tied into the scene more, and we can more easily control that scene via the normal Lumen controls. Secondly, we have the ability to control the amount of direct and indirect hit events. As you can see, as I increase these, we get more layering, so more depth to the refraction. A key thing you might also notice is if I decrease these lower than what would be required for the number of layers in this mesh, we don't get any black spots where we're not tracing enough depth. And that's because, unlike the old method, it basically falls back to the rastered scene when it gets to the limit of depth. It just fills in those black spots, which means you can have high quality first few layers of refraction, but at a good performance without it looking weird, right? And for most cases, you can get away with just like three primary hit events, and then the indirect gets you like kind of like the internal reflections inside of the glass. So sometimes you don't even need that at all, depending on what you're doing. Another major advantage is that over the old method, it now supports proper rough refraction, cloudy glass, no more doing a custom scene color blur in a material. You just get your roughness and away you go. You might also notice that the depth of field's working on this, which setting our material to output depth like you would a normal translucent material means that we can get it affected by depth of field compared to the old method's complete disregard for this setting. It just never did it. It would always appear not blurred, no matter what you did. Another example here is this beach scene, which I whipped up a few months ago. Before this new mode of ray trace translucency, it was essentially impossible to get this exact look that I was after without using, path tracing. The water surfaces are inherently tricky to represent with deforming overlapping geometry, right? Rasterized rendering just doesn't really cut it for these kind of situations. You could do it like if you were further away, it would be nicer, but when you're this close, there's kind of no substitute, right? Now, our last topic is MegaLights, which is obviously a newer addition to Unreal Engine. And while there's a big rush of people being amazed that you could do millions of shadowing lights everywhere, like tons of them with the stochastic ray trace light sampling, an often overlooked element is actually just the major performance win the system can provide, depending on your scenes. Let's turn to the Days Adrift scene here. This project was originally designed, started last year, to be rendered completely offline. It has over 150 ray trace light sources, not including emissive surfaces, as well as over 80 billion polygons in total in the scene. At 100% screen percentage on a AMD 7900 XTX, it ran at around 8 FPS, as you can see here. It actually didn't even matter if you switched to VSMs or ray tracing, it was just that heavy. It didn't matter what you did, just by design, it was basically at that point an offline rendered scene. If we turn on MegaLights, and there you go, instant jump to around 35 FPS, and this is still, everything else is overcranked, set to cinematic settings and etc. In fact, the performance gain was so intense, I got a bit curious about the Steam Deck sitting on my desk in front of me. After all, the Steam Deck supports hardware ray tracing, right? Well, most of the time that question is followed by a bunch of caveats that while yes it does, it's pretty underpowered in that department and generally you wouldn't want to do too much with it. But to my absolute surprise, combined with a few other tweaks, like switching to software Lumen for GI, reducing the rendered resolution a bit, I was able to hit a fairly consistent 30 frames a second. Now that's not to suggest you should put an 80 billion poly scene on a Steam Deck. The battery life is bad. But I thought, if this is how well a scene designed for offline rendering runs, what about a more traditional game as a way to get nice soft ray trace shadows, but on a portable platform? Just so happened that the latest Ludum Dare was about to start at the time, so I enlisted the help of my daughter, Alex, yes, named after Alex Vance, to do all of the artwork and story for a little platformer with the goal of using MegaLights and for it to run well on the Steam Deck. The project was called Cardboard Kitty, and it was a complete success in terms of its original goals. All the characters were made of high poly nanite cardboard made in Houdini. And all the designs were drawn by Alex, all the frames. And she came up with the story, obviously. Very cute. On its own, the lighting situation did not run well with Steam Deck. And that's because I really wanted those really soft, very soft ray trace shadows that you couldn't, like, even further than what you can do generally with VSMs easily. But with MegaLights, we easily hit 35 to 45 FPS at full resolution on the Steam Deck, which was completely transformative, obviously. I quite like to use this as an example in response to when people say that Nanite and Lumen are only for hyper-realistic projects or high-end machines. Because although this project uses a more cutesy art style and has minimal texture work, it really comes alive because of these systems, right? There's a lot of light bounce, there's a lot of soft shadows. The cardboard really works because it's actual geometry. When you see it on the side, you can see into it. It's all scrappy and the light catches all the little ripped parts. And for a game made in 48 hours, it performed pretty well with no optimization. Now, MegaLights certainly is a very interesting beast when you start to delve into using it in a project. I've noticed some bounce off it due to the system because of slight temporal instability that gets introduced. But of course, you knew this was coming. There's a CVAR for that. Downsample factor is set with r.megalights.downsample factor, which you can influence the resolution that the MegaLights resolve is rendered at. By default, it's at 2, I believe. So it's half res or quarter res, depending on the way you look at it. I often set it to 1, which is, full resolution. But you can just as easily set it to a factor in between 1 and 2. And it does tend to clean up the noise, as you can see here. This is from 2 to 1. And 1's completely respectable. I didn't manage to get a clip in of 1.5, but it still looks a lot better. Performance difference isn't much at all, well, in this scene at least. I actually couldn't see a discernible difference. One of the major wins for MegaLights 2 is that unlike normal ray trace shadowing, you don't actually get nanite fallback mesh issues due to a really well thought out screen space component that essentially checks if there's a problem intersection mismatch. And to my eye, it generally works pretty flawlessly. Here you can see major shadowing issues with this mesh because the whole thing's one mesh. So the ray tracing fallback mesh is not very high res. And with MegaLights enabled, it just completely cleans up the result. You don't even tend to get much artifacts on the edge of the screen, which you'd expect with the screen space element, while still somehow increasing performance in some scenes like this one from 2 times to 10 times, depending on what you're doing. Now, it's a little hard for me to capture Steam Deck footage, but I did bring my Steam Deck. Sorry. I did bring my Steam Deck. So if you want to see it running on there, either the Cardboard Kitty or the stupidly high detail scene, the poor Steam Deck is very battered now. Then come see me. I guess I'll go to the dev lounge after, and if you have any questions and such. Thanks so much for coming and listening to me talk about pretty graphics. Hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. And are there any questions? Yeah.
I noticed in the renders there were still some like fireflies or flickering. Is that something Unreal intends to resolve at any time?
Yeah, I mean, it's always improving. I tend to notice that every single release, stuff seems to get a lot better, especially in 5.6. From 5.5 to 5.6, there's actually a huge difference. For one of the comparisons that I had planned for this, I actually had to do a different comparison because actually there was no difference. They'd basically cleaned up the situation that I wanted to show. So it does seem like every release it's progressing a lot, and I think that's that shows through in their commitment to hardware Lumen being by default now. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Anyone else? I can't actually see.
Hello.
Hello.
Great talk.
Thanks.
And especially that translucency stuff, that blew me away. So are you planning on releasing that kind of graph and stuff online, or is it already
Sorry, which one was it?
the translucency stuff with your the graph that you showed for
Oh.
faking?
Yeah,
the-
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly at some point. Yeah, I like releasing my stuff in general in some way, but it generally usually takes a while for me to in a testing environment, and then to release something to the public. It's usually a bit of work to make sure everything's all nice and laid out, etc.
Yeah, especially thank you for pointing out like substrate. That was something that we were very hesitant in trying out because it's like, oh, that'll just cause more issues. It's a totally different pipeline. But after seeing that, it's something definitely to try out.
Yeah, it's quite easy because obviously, mean free path might look scary if you're not used to it, right? But that's really the main thing you actually have to kind of take note of, because it's kind of it's not exactly the reverse, but it's dealing with a more physically accurate measurement, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hey Dylan, thank you for the lecture. Really nice. I mean, it's really awesome to look at the quality that you reached.
Oh,
and
thanks.
I don't have question. I have ask. When can we see your tutorials on YouTube? Because I really want to implement all the idea that you found in Unreal.
Mhm.
And this is not question. This is about ask. When
Oh,
can
yeah.
you find it?
I do have a YouTube. I forgot to actually put links in my slides, and then I realized I was like, oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky if you just search my name, and also on YouTube if you just search my name, it comes up, or my name in Unreal probably. I don't do as much, but I do have some tutorials covering some of these stuff coming out in video later in the year, I think. That covering especially the high-res assets and things, because that was in a partnership with them. But then the rest, yeah, I've definitely thought about putting more up. I tend to, on Blue Sky and socials, I tend to post a lot of that stuff there. But I've definitely been thinking about putting it into a more easy to use format to find. But yes, yeah, definitely. It should be on the cards, hopefully. Yeah.
Thank you. And I mean, if you can share it, your knowledge, it's really awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, no problem. Thank you, everyone.